in this section, in the sense that animation is used as a tool of kind of exploration. But I'm not exploring mental states or stories of individual people. It's more about investigating different cultures. And the whole point of the project I'm presenting here is basically taking the cinematic machine, the mechanical machine, which was invented fairly, I mean, not so far away back in time. Like, there's a history of cinematic language. There's maybe like 100 years history of it in our European, Euro-American society. So actually what I'm trying to do is to go back, to kind of rewind this machine and try to capture either mythologies or the stories of people who were not using in their traditional cultures cinema. And the whole point is actually to make the people, to give them a chance, or actually enable them to make their own movies. And it's a curious mixture of visual anthropology and computer science. I studied both actually. And I will take you to Australia. The reason why is because I spent there 1 year in 2006 researching the didgeridoo, and I found out that the most of the things we perceive as exotic or even aboriginal, it's kind of like a work of our European imagination. And then I came up with this idea to use the context what I have from Australia, from Top End, Arnhem Land region, that maybe I can use it for production of animated movie. And the thing is that the production of 3D or animation movie, it's fairly difficult thing technically, and that's what I'm trying to solve in this paper. It's somehow a proposal. I will show you also existing projects which connect to this project. Somehow they are close enough, but it's not the same what I try to show you. So I would like to hear your comments later on your opinions, because the project is still in process, and I like to take Dennis from Australia back to his homeland, so he doesn't feel so uncomfortable in the rainy weather in Edinburgh. So, where's the, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the main question, that's what I already said, is it possible to represent native knowledge with contemporary visual technologies using audiovisual machine originally created by Western civilization? Many of the cultures before, they were using just pictures or even designs which were not about to last in the time. For example, the famous dot painting from Australia, curiously enough, it got invented in 1972. Geoffrey Barden in Papunya community, he introduced acrylic paints to the communities, and the art just started itself. I mean, the origin of the art there was before, but the actual form of acrylic paint on canvas and the dots, it just originated in 1972. Another question, how could be different worldviews represented and accommodated into new audiovisual media? Such things are already happening. I will show you a few projects which were done in Top End, Australia. This is a very specific region because most of the culture of Aboriginal people in Australia was basically taken away by the colonization of Australia, and only the really remote place in Top End around Kakadu National Park, Darwin, it's called Arnhem Land, and there's the only place where they still have the culture, they still speak the language, and that's where the project is aiming to. So the theoretical concept is based on, there's the visual anthropology in it. There's a book, Through Navajo Eyes by Salworth and John Adair. It's from the 70s, and those people actually, for the first time in anthropology or in a cinematic history, they used film as a probe, as a tool to understand different cultures. So what happened back then was that they actually used real cameras, the 16mm Bell and Howell cameras, and they brought them into Navajo reservation in the United States, and they basically made a workshop about 10 days long when they showed them how to use them, and then they created groups of, I don't know, 5, 6 people, and they let them do their own films. So basically now we are going kind of against our filmic language. That's actually the deal, that we give the people possibility to express themselves in the medium which they never used before, and such we can understand how the culture works, or we can learn even more than just purely describing. That's the thing. For example, anthropology, it started as only descriptive scientific branch. We were describing other people, other cultures by our own language, but now we try to turn this paradigm. So paradigma. They call the technique biodocumentary. So the question of my project is, can we create animated biodocumentary? That's what I was talking about, visual anthropology and the life of other people, the otherness. Do we have the right to always describe the others? Where's the culture boundary? Can cultures be copyrighted? And that's the thing. It goes from structure to process. So you basically give the people who you are describing, you give them the voice to kind of speak out. Or, for example, just to illustrate this, I think New Zealanders call, or even Aboriginals, they call the day of discovery of Australia the invasion day. So you can see those are kind of like conflicting views on the same event. So basically that's the same thing what I'm trying to achieve. There's another side to it. It's medium the message by animation. So that's a classical McLuhan statement. I call him sometimes MC Luhan. But the thing is that the technology has itself some power to transfer the ideas. It's the best way to understand it. It's like if you have a little time to read Enchantment of Technology and Technology of Enchantment by Alfred Gell. He's from London University College of London, and there's a fairly new branch of anthropology which is trying to understand objects or things or even films from the point of view of the technologists. Like they try to understand it as a kind of like magician trick, applying some agency over the people who are watching it. So I will explain in a bit. Also, I mentioned the dot painting, Papua, Geoffrey Barden. He kind of set up new media form, and now it's well accepted, and I would say that it brought lots of recognition into Aboriginal community, even though you can say it's somehow invented tradition. The many people who were before the Aboriginals, who were merely servants at the cattle stations, suddenly they get recognition in America or in Europe as a real up-to-date artist of modern art. So it's really interesting. This is just for illustration. If you happen to have the copy of the Alfred Gell's essay, what do you see? Many people see only designs which has to be displayed in a museum, or somehow materials which are nice as a craft or art. But Alfred Gell is saying that this is not art. It's for the people, for the community. It's kind of a psychological weapon. It's basically part of the fighting power, because he's saying that the people who were able to craft from the hardwood, this canoe is actually decorated by a shield. And it's not protective shield. It's more like showing their power over the material. They can craft it. It's not really easy to do it. And many tribes in the area, this is from Papua New Guinea, many tribes, they can't do it. So they use it as a psychological warfare. So they are showing we are so technologically advanced that, you know, you better run off the beach and don't you know, the resistance is futile. So The same applies, I would say, he's not mentioning it, but it applies to the cinematography as well. I mean, when you use really advanced 3D, it's like, okay, guys, we can transfer our story into different media. So this is now I show you the existing projects. Arnhem it's, you can see the top end, like the middle peninsula. Up there's like a peninsula. It's huge. It's like 1,000 kilometers across. On the bay, little bay, which is on the left, there's Darwin, and this is magnification of the. I don't know how to. No, that's not. If you see the upper stretch as the right side, so there's the detail of this area. This famous place for many Aboriginal artists. There's an art tradition called cross-hatching, which has long tradition compared to dot painting, which are just lines making different patterns, and most of the artifacts from this area can be bought in Jirkala art station. It's also home to the didgeridoo. Once a year there's a Garma festival where you can see all the tribes, and it's fairly remote because you need permissions to go in, and it's there's still witchcraft going on, and it's crazy place. It's for example, if you want to have a glimpse of this, the best to do is see the movie 10 Canoes. I'm not sure if you are familiar. It's called 10 Canoes, and this is from this area. And yeah, I spent 5 months there actually in 2006, and it was amazing to see it firsthand. But back to the existing projects. One thing is interpretation of the exotic cultures. That's one of the examples. Lilly, I think, is he Australian originally or New Zealander, right? And this is example of using the visual language of primitive tribes, and we somehow imply that it's that's the way it is. That's the original thing. But I would say this is more like our interpretation of their world. So we are basically stealing their visual or making reinterpretation. Another project which goes behind this, which goes directly in the community, it's Eric Michaels, and he's describing how he set up Aboriginal TV in 1987. He basically, it was like a punk project. He got financed to do it, but he was fighting with the communication of Department of Communication of Australia, because they didn't have any permissions to set up TV station, but they did actually in remote outback community. And he taught the people how to use the equipment, and basically it was not TV for them, it was TV operated by the Aboriginal community. And there's one interesting thing to understand when you deal with the media of different cultures. European cultures have been striving to invent more efficient ways to increase their capacity to broadcast as much information as possible to as many people as possible. Whether oral traditional societies need to narrowcast information in a very controlled manner in order to survive. So there's totally different way to work with the information within those communities. It's for example, some people die and you can never use their image, their voice. For example, the dot painting, it's there's somehow like secret messages hidden inside it. It's more like for initiated members of the groups, which means it's nothing really secret. It's more like showing you where you find some food in a certain time of year. But what the implication of this means that basically what we are seeing here in Europe, all these Aboriginal paintings, those are basically kids' drawings which are recognized as harmless, to general public, which means that when we see the Aboriginal art, this is something which is meant to be general audience. We have no idea what's in different layers behind it. So just to let you know the difference between the media in European society and Aboriginal society. There's another existing project which is really, it's probably the most close to what I would like to achieve. It's a Dust Echo series, and it's really nice. You can find it on the internet. It was done by, I think, ABC television station, Vicious Productions, and they basically went to Beswick Station community. It's also part of Arnhem, and they recorded the stories, and they redone it in a studio. The thing is, what I would like to do in a different way is use the visual, which actually connects to the visual style of the community, because this is basically applying our visual strategy or our visual language to their story. So we are still interpreting their story with our visual language. I would like to go one step further, and this is still screenshots from the Dust Echoes. And I would like to go one step further to actually incorporate the visual style in the story itself. I mean, it's really beautiful. It's very well done, and it's worth looking at it. The last project is a Mulka project from Mirkala Arts, and that's the way it is now in Ireland, because they are very aware of their culture, of the potential it has. It's maybe like Scotland, like they try to, defend their own identity. They feel kind of trapped inside this touristic representation of Australia, like everybody playing didgeridoo, throwing boomerangs, and all these things. Everybody knows they are for sure Australians, but they try to understand people that they are the owners of the knowledge which was left from the past still. So we want to bring knowledge of the past into the present for future generations, and to understand what meaning it has in the present day and age. So this is probably the closest to the project I would like to achieve. And this is connected to Yotu Indie Band. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's a famous band from 80s, and they played with Neil Young as well, and Midnight Oil. And they also live top end Australia. And they founded Yotu Indie Foundation, and they basically set up their own audiovisual center. So this is their own initiative. So those are the screenshots from the Garma Festival. So just to describe the project, I was thinking about, it's not necessarily taking the whole studio pipeline, which I'm talking about the 3D animation to the outstation. It could be also inspiring culture event for local community, which means to get some, not maybe the Yirukala Arts, but maybe some other community which they would be interested in sharing their stories. And this is the technical solution. It's when you do 3D animation, you basically animate according to visual references to kind of capture the real acting of the characters. So there will be the bridging between the 3D technology and their community. So you can basically reanimate some dances. They have really wild dances and really beautiful performances. And there could be the characters' drawings used for creating of the digital puppets, and all the screenplay would have been done during the workshop. So there would be more space for them than just recording the story and taking it back to the Western studio. This would be the actual approach of Solworth and John Adair, basically giving them out the technology. It doesn't mean that they would operate the actual cameras, but it would mean that they would directly be linked into the pipeline of the technology process. Yeah. So, and this is also discussion, is this remediation of culture context using new audiovisual technologies a way to cultural survival of indigenous groups or disappearing cultures? I mean, this question points to the fact that many of the surviving cultures, they turn into touristic attraction at some point. They try to preserve the culture so hard that it becomes like a block monument preserved in a concrete somehow. It's, for example, I come from Czech Republic, and in Moravia, the culture, there's a rich culture area, and all these costumes, they just become preserved as an unchanging, I don't know how to say, they just become preserved. And this is somehow, this project, I believe that it would bring more of living culture into the community. That's what Jirkala art is actually trying to do as well. And yeah, that's, I was talking about ethno-imitation versus authentic. The most of the ethno movies, for example, like Kirikou, the African mythology, it's also our way of perceiving their culture. So it's our interpretation. You see Marlo Morgan's story about the indigenous people of Australia. It's kind of like catering to New Age feel in the 70s. Invention of dot art. It's also our intention to see what we want to see there. And this is really great. What I like, it's brown. Can culture be copyrighted? Souls lost in the forest of copies take up desperate search for the original that leads to indigenous people in seeking authenticity. They succeed only in fashioning another simulacrum, which is, I think that's the point. So, in trying to see the real origin, suddenly we realize we are just creating something from our imagination. I hope it works. It should start up. It's just a short example from a Dusty code.
Hope, I'd just like to say I hope that some of you were in the talk that Nea gave, because towards the end of my paper, what I'm saying there is just a footnote to what she said. Okay, can you hear me if I speak without this mic? Be all right? Okay. The photograph or film can reveal much about an urban space's anthropology, history, and decay. From the start, artists altered photos to add a different mood. But animation as a creative practice can merge the truth value of the photographic index with visualization of otherwise ideational, i.e. mentally imagined or constructive, or subjective experience. As a time-based visual medium, animation has the unique capacity to combine documentary photography with animation in the same frame, with the periodicity of time added. It can add imagery that has little in common with our lived and hence documentable experience of the world, and much more affinity with personal or subjective experience. Animators can usurp the photographed real world and reinterpret it using an array of invasive techniques: photocopiers, drawing, and digital technologies, collage, superimposition, and mixed media. I'm asking an overarching question that some of the conference speakers in different ways are addressing to animation films that fall into the genre of documentary, and mine specifically addresses autobiography or essay film. Where does the objective documentary stop and fiction and/or subjective interpretation begin? My point on the shifting fulcrum that this question balances on are the powerful interpretive qualities of animators' use of documentary stills, shots, and sequences of cities and urban spaces, and how they create new ways of experiencing real-world locations. Animation that exploits photography or uses a live-action film as a material base are as wide-ranging as the architecture and street scenes that they capture. Writing about the urban documentary, John Gold and Stephen Ward, not Paul Ward, Stephen Ward, suggest that, I quote, although documentary films are usually defined as films distinguished by high factual and sociological content and a subject matter that charts the lives of people in their everyday environments, they share many characteristics with fictional film, the main difference being the documentarist does not rely on controlling the mise en scène. New York-based George Griffin's block print from 1977 is a good example of reworking this kind of imagery. It's based on a single continuous live-action shot of about 2 minutes of a walk around of 4 sides of a city block that simply records the street and the buildings in his everyday environment without any control of the mise en scène. He uses the same shot over and over again for a series of variations, and I'll show you a few stills of this now. The film starts with a map. That's his finger. This is followed by a live action sequence from this full circle walk on the left, your left, that starts with this building on Great Jones Street that I got from Google. Then a negative print sequence of the same footage turned at a 90-degree clockwise angle. And then this image relocates you on that street corner. That's not how you'd see it in the film. That's how you'd see it in the film. He then prints this negative up to paper. I put the film strip image sideways on the right, i.e. sprockets on the top, so you see the relation to the previous images, and it's the same corner, again, of this building. Griffin then used the same material as a basis for a rather simple yet effective manipulation, relying on the then cutting-edge reproduction technologies of Xeroxing. He enlarged and copied the developed film strip on large-size continuous rolls of paper, the result being a large paper version of the film strip. He then sat himself at a cutting board with a single-frame rostrum camera set up above his hands. Now shot in live action, we see Griffin cutting the frames from the roll frame at a time. This too has a documentary feel, a calm, objective record of creative and technical process of the artist in his working environment. He then reshot the film using the Xerox paper frames in single frame, his hands then a flurry over the paper frames that are animated to show the walk around the block on the cutting board. If you saw the film, you wouldn't see the hand. It's a grab, so you see the hand. But what he's doing is he's animating this, so you see the walk around the block, and his hands are just like a butterfly blur. It's beautiful. Griffin, who's known for his creative work with flipbooks and their variations, assembled these frames as a large flipbook set on a bicycle apparatus with a camera mounted that framed both the flipbook and the city environment that he had filmed. The flipbook pages were then shot frame by frame, timed during moving around the block to temporarily coincide with the surrounding urban space backdrop that was also captured. There are 5 walks in total based on the live action record. Negative stock, Xerox copying, and finally a flipbook transmute the original documentary record into a personal interpretation of a New York neighborhood. I'd love to show you the film, but it's 18 minutes long. We need to see at least 5 minutes of it. So suffice it to say that block print is a self-reflexive love affair with a Manhattan block. As an animated urban document, it's a tour de force of spatial play, temporal manipulation, and a collision of graphics with photographic realism. Griffin's canon-like editing and masterful play with simultaneity and different temporalities and aesthetic interventions of different images within a single image is a lesson in the potency of animation techniques to express a personal, and I would venture essayistic, take on a documentary subject. It questions our perception of daily experience and transforms a walk around the block into insights into the animation filmmaking process, its working spaces, and its materiality. I'll now turn to a film that works with a combination of photography with drawn or painted 2D animation. This hybrid technique affects a whole series of essential aesthetic, phenomenological, and practical changes. Helmut Weisman, architectural theorist, proposes that, I quote, that cinematic architectural design can reveal what prima vista remains hidden to the observer or what remains hidden without the cinematic apparatus. Film can be an instrument for reading architecture, end quote. A film that does this with a political reading is Paul Vester's award-winning Picnic from 1987. The images I'll show you have different dimensions because I used 2 different DVDs and they have different aspect ratios, so some are a bit wider. One's from the artist, one's from somebody else that I think filmed it from a cinema screen. I'm glad I got it back before I knew Paul. So Vester combines documentary photography, images that he shot and collected in Argentina, the Middle East, and the USA, and animated imagery to express his own particular relationship with the cities and urban spaces that he documents and then deconstructs. Vester's research is complex and thorough. Autobiographic, documentary, and found photographs that mirror his personal and political position find their way onto a form of storyboard. He then employs an array of techniques, superimposing animated graphics and multi-layered cell artwork onto these photographed cultural spaces. These are then arranged to a musical montage. I'm going to show you the film. It's short, so you'll get to experience it. Used as backgrounds, these single photographs gain a temporal and spatial quality that embeds them as locations for the animated events and figures, as these stills will show you. These hybrid combinations are illogical, but they make sense to us because the filmmaker designs the interface between the photographic situation and animated enhancements and invasions in such a way that we can develop certain schemata to understand them. George Griffin suggests, I quote, Vester's fidgeting figures and saccadic editing strategy serve to sustain a mood of unrelieved urban paranoia. I take this further to suggest that Vester's animated overlays allude to the Cold War and to nuclear catastrophe. As the film progresses, it's 3 minutes and 20 seconds long, what seem to be radioactive blobs invade the images, and as their glow expands, figures run for shelter or are annihilated in a red neon flash that reminds us of the Hiroshima outline traces and shadows of people that remained after their bodies were vaporized by the hydrogen bomb. But this is only part of Vester's political program. If we look closer, some of his photographic elements are fleeting, sometimes only a second, a frame, less than a second, a 1/12 of a second, a 24th of a second. Interspersed from the start of the film, photographs documenting murder, genocide, and poverty in the non-Western world provide an unsettling contrast to the plenitude and playfulness of the animated depiction of consumer culture. These are disturbing. At 2:43, a longer series of these, underlaid with a kind of screech or a scream, engage us in a sustained perception of the gore, violence, and inhumanity done to human bodies, making clear that Vester's program is a deeply political one. So we'll now watch the film. It's about 3 minutes long, and if it works, yeah, it's already ready to go. The essay film itself is a slippery genre, and it's mainly distinguished by its merging of the self and the experience of the world within the real world. Writing about Chris Marker's essay films, or Marker, as he's called here, Chris Marker, Timothy Corrigan suggests the representational heterogeneity of Letter from Siberia also parallels that of Marker's photo essay, as the film mixes black and white and color film, still photographs, archival footage, and animation to underline here also how the bond between experience and representation is the fault line between the world and our knowledge of it. I think Vester's done a beautiful job of doing that with his own film. Vester's photographs, murder, genocide, poverty, partisans, nuclear disaster, are a personal commentary on the injustice of global politics, inhumanity, and war. I regard his work as part of a continuum of political dissents like Marker and Harun Farooqi, both of whom work with animation in their documentary essays. I've also got a lovely anecdote. I met Paul by chance at the Barbican opening. There's a big exhibition in London. And I told him I was doing something on Picnic, and I said, he said, what? And I said, I'm writing about it as an animated documentary essay. He grabbed my arm, took me over to his partner and said, tell her we've been arguing about this for the last 20 years. So, you know, whether or not it holds, but it's what he intended. So he was very happy about that. So I'll now just turn very briefly to my third and final example to explore the shift from the photochemical index to subjective digital and virtual interpretation and creation of urban spaces with Second Life. I also have to say that Paul, I can't remember his last name, Paul, I chaired a panel this morning that something really remarkable came up. I asked him if what he was positing was whether or not the ideational, which is something I've been trying to argue for a long time, the ideational is actually a good case to make against the index, and he said yes. So discussion to be continued. So if you were at his paper, I'm thinking about that as I'm reading this, and it's something that I would have written differently if I'd had that conversation with him. So to Second Life. Okay, sorry. Second Life raises a set of compelling queries about our understanding of the impact of animation on the moving image document, as Nea so beautifully illustrated just before. The stated goal of Second Life's creators at Linden Labs is to create a metaverse. This was defined by cyber author Neil Stevenson in Snow Crash. A metaverse is a user-defined world where people can interact, play, do business, and otherwise communicate. Writing in 1955, before most of us here were born, Guy Debord, the father of psychogeography, uncannily seemed to anticipate the Second Life metaverse when he proposed that we can, I quote, create at little expense an atmosphere of uneasiness extremely favorable for the introduction of a few new conceptions of pleasure. And he suggests that we create a chosen emotional situation to do this. In reference to creating the situation, Debord writes, The idea that the creation of a chosen emotional situation depends only on the thorough understanding and calculated application of a certain number of concrete techniques. Okay. That he writes inspired this somewhat tongue-in-cheek psychogeographical Game of the Week, 1955 Game of the Week, published and published #1. I'll read it even though you have it here. In accordance with what you are seeking, choose a country and a more or less populated city, a more or less busy street. Build a house, furnish it. Use decorations and surroundings to the best advantage. Choose the season and the time of day. Bring together the most suitable people with appropriate records and drinks. The lighting and the conversation should obviously be suited to the occasion, as should be the weather or your memories. If there's been no error in your calculations, the result should satisfy you. We need to work toward flooding the market, even if for the moment merely the intellectual market, with a mass of desires whose realization is not beyond the capacity of man's present means of action on the material world, but only beyond the capacity of the old social organization. In Second Life, users employ concrete digital techniques to do all of this, and many have extreme emotional investment in their avatars and created worlds, often autobiographically modeled psychogeographies with real-world references, homes, workplaces, gyms, bedrooms. 50 years on, the market is now flooded with online outlets for the massive desires and satisfies what Debord calls a new conception of pleasure. Part of the pleasure is a narcissistic one, as people live their second lives through optimized avatars, creating a new idealized autobiography or, I venture, essay of unlived lives that can be unsettlingly distinct from their lived ones. With this in mind, I'll return to the essay film and one of its greatest proponents, Chris Marker. Marker has created a world in Second Life that he spends all his time in, that documents the life of his avatar Guillaume, which is based on his real-life cat. He has a cat fetish beyond belief. I know this from somebody who knows him. It's not conjecture. His move to Second World raises some very interesting questions for the autobiographic and essay film, but I'll have to leave them for now. I just want to flag it up. So to conclude, I'll turn to another salient point that Debord makes. I quote, "The imaginary is that which tends to become real," wrote an author whose name, on account of his notorious intellectual degradation, I have since forgotten, end quote. In the meantime, we know that this forgotten author was surrealist André Breton, and the citation is from his 1932 Le Revolver aux Chevaux Blancs, the White Horse Revolver. In an uncanny return to the surrealists, Blockprint, Second Life, and Picnic do, in varying degrees, in the animated essay film, what Thomas Pynchon, the author, proposed that the surrealists did. Quote, "One could combine inside the same frame elements not normally found together to produce illogical and startling effects," end quote. Films like Griffin's and Vestas do exactly this, and their animated interventions offer an essayistic gesture to documentary reality that respects the spatial coherence for the former and the ethical urgency for the latter. They also provide a poetic experience of their psychogeographic interpretations. Griffith's subtle reworking and revisioning of a simple walk emphasizes the mutability of the photographic image and offers a new way of seeing an everyday experience. Vester's Apocalypse makes use of images of torture, death, and suffering that are sensitively embedded in a critique of war, consumption, and power. These single frames of salient politically charged imagery of violence done to humans have a clear political and aesthetic purpose. They force us to engage with the crass contradiction of the animated consumer culture that he superimposes. Both filmmakers respect the creative, social, and political origins of the photography that they work with. Second Life, however, blurs these boundaries, as Nea so eloquently pointed out. While, like the documentary, it has a high factual and sociological content and a subject matter that charts the lives of people in their everyday environments, its interactive creative tools allow complete control of the mise en scène. While Klein defines media like this as belonging to, I quote, "a cross-media genre of interactive fiction," end quote, Second Life's idealized autobiography and digital imitations of the real world, its mixing of fact and fiction, demands we define a new subgenre of animated documentary, the animated essay, for instance, and I'd be happy to chat and argue with you about that later. Through the illusion of animated cinema and the digital tools of dots and zeros, these and many other animated films that we will discover in the course of these 2 days, I hope, have perhaps unconsciously, and this was, after all, the main point of the surrealists, that the unconscious, the dream, and our experience of the real phenomenal world were equivalents and not in a hierarchy of truth, have made the autobiographical imaginary real and the this is something I just added, the autobiographical ideational a possibility. Thank you.
At King's College in London, the thesis title is Transformative Art, the Aesthetics of Experimental Animation. And the title of Lilly's paper today is The Kaleidoscopic Windscreen, Stuart Hilton's experimental animated documentary, 6 weeks in June. Over to you, Lilly.
Thank you. As Paul just pointed out to me before this panel started, I want to make a correction. In my abstract, I said that it was Paul Ward who had said the first quote, and in fact it was Paul Wells. I apologize for that mistake, entirely mine.
It's everything.
Yeah, no. Anyway, thanks. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin today by saying that this paper is part of a longer chapter I've written on experimental animated documentary for my dissertation on the aesthetics of experimental animation. And it's a fairly common feature of avant-garde filmmaking to subvert conventional viewing practices and to suppress the normal perception of moving images. And one of the most difficult things about thinking and writing about experimental animation is the fact that most of these works often intentionally defy straightforward interpretation. And they often are even difficult to describe. In my work, I'm masochistically drawn to experimental animations whose frenetic rates of change average about 1 or 2 frames per image, and which far exceed our capacity for comfortable perception and integration. And thus, attempting to closely analyze these films can be frustratingly chimerical, in that arresting any particular point in time in order to make comment upon it immediately destroys the truth of its experience. Nevertheless, I continue to fight the good fight and persevere in my attempt to lasso the whirlwind. In any case, this paper is a work in progress, so I look forward to your comments and questions after the talk. The animated documentary I'm going to speak to you about today is a kind of wild epic packed into 6 minutes, which captures the essence of one artist's journey across the American continent. Stuart Hilton's 1998 film, 6 Weeks in June, is a rapid-fire, black and white experimental representation of the artist's experience whilst traveling, in his words, 11,000 miles across the USA and back in a transit van with a rock and roll band, a pencil, a stack of A6 paper, and 6 weeks in June to do it. It is a delirious mixture of actual audiovisual record, artistic impressions, abstraction, language, and music. Beginning with the surreal compression and elongation of time suggested by its nonsensical name and the imbricated days of the calendar that appear in the title sequence, Hilton uses his free-form, rapid-fire, experimental style throughout the film to both condense and recreate sensations of travel-induced overstimulation. It is a travel diary film par excellence, recording myriad fleeting locations, observations, feelings, and judgments, and it celebrates the joy and the tedium of life on the road. Hilton's super-selective animation style expresses the emotional ambivalence of finding out for himself the actualities of what had been for him, again in his own words, a romantic lifelong dream to be in a band doing a tour of America. As a result, his film simultaneously honors the mythos of the American West, whilst it also casts a critical European eye upon the same landscape. 6 Weeks in June exhibits a mixture of European and American qualities in important aesthetic ways as well. I believe the film can be seen as a sort of experimental animated road movie with its roots in the traditions of the early European and mid-20th century American avant-garde filmmaking. Nonetheless, 6 Weeks in June defies neat theoretical categorization. While the film illustrates a modernist interest in formal experiment and the ambiguities of spatial and temporal fragmentation, it is equally an animated example of the subjective, autobiographical strain in experimental documentary. It also has aesthetic elements in common with American avant-garde films like Bruce Bailey's cross-country chronicle Quixote, Ron Rice's 1962 Senseless, and its kinetic use of line drawing strikingly resembles parts of Robert Breer's animated film Fuji. Whatever its predecessors, however, Hilton's film is a truly unique combination of animated document, subjective autobiography, and formal experimentation, and thus I argue today that it makes its own significant contribution to the avant-garde practice of experimental documentary filmmaking. Its extraordinarily free and expressive experimental animated style captures the especially remembered experience of being on the road better than any live-action documentary I have ever seen. Now, a bit of a backstory before I show you the clip. As he says, Hilton took with him on tour a stack of A6 note cards and a pencil, and to pass the dull hours on the road, he used them as a sort of visual diary, making notes of what was said in the van and bits of overheard conversation, illustrating witnessed events and, excuse me, drawing diagrams of room layouts, views from motels and the van's windows. He kept the notes in chronological order with vague thoughts to ultimately turn the drawings into an animated film when he returned home. And members of the band kept a video record of parts of the trip, and these recordings supplied the audio for the film. Once back in England, it took Hilton exactly 6 weeks to finish the film. His animation technique was entirely spontaneous, and he states that all of the animation from, and I'm quoting, all the animation was from memory and nothing was rotoscoped. The DV footage was not referred to for visual cues, and the idea was to extract a more emotional response from the drawings, or as I thought of them, the diary. I never tested any of it. I gauged roughly how long it would be by the height of the final stacks of A6 paper. As you'll see, the spontaneity of Hilton's animations process is very much reflected in the experience of watching the film. Now I'll show you a clip of it, and it's quite a frenzy of oral and visual stimulation. Modernist poetic documentaries of the late 1920s and early 1930s, such as the city symphonies like Cavalcante, Rien que les heures, Ruttman's Berlin, A Symphony of a Great City, Ivan's Rain, Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, and Vigo's À propos de Nice, to name a few. But Bill Nichols has noted that these films reveled in, and I quote, representing reality in terms of a series of fragments, subjective impressions, incoherent acts, and loose associations. He describes their poetic mode as one that opens up the possibility for alternative forms of knowledge and that stresses mood, tone, and affect much more than displays of knowledge or acts of persuasion. And this poetic mode focuses on the often ephemeral and fragmented nature of subjectivity and emphasizes the ambiguities of experience. I see in 6 Weeks in June something of the poetic spirit of these early documentaries, searching beyond the confines of narrative and conventional editing to find a formal representation of particular moods, times, and places. Aesthetically, I see this connection in the film's black and white, expressionistic, and fragmentary depictions that render commonplace objects and spaces abstract. They share a common interest in fixating on and expanding upon certain details or parts of objects. Often, the fleeting glimpses of bits of text act as mood cues like implanted intertitles. I also see their influence in the film's relentless interest in speed and kinesis. Like these films, Hilton's non-narrative, experimental animation style abstains from creating clear continuity from image to image, sacrificing the sense of a very specific, sorry, this is a Nichols quote as well, the sense of a very specific location in time and place to explore associations and patterns that involve temporal rhythms and spatial juxtaposition. His sketch-like visuals capture, in simple, stark, black and white line animation, the disjointed and fragmented experiences of vision and audition in motion, from the little everyday details that catch one's attention for a fleeting second to those that stand out in one's memories. Now, there are a number of obvious differences between these early documentaries and Hilton's 1998 6 Weeks in June. The two main differences that I want to point out are firstly, and obviously, that 6 Weeks is animated, and secondly, that it uses location sound. I'd like to say a few words now about this second difference. As I've said, Hilton used the band's travel videos audio for his soundtrack, and he makes use of the ambient, phonographic, and multi-source sound to emphasize the subjective experience of the fleeting temporality of travel. Throughout the film, there is an almost constant sound of literally being on the road, or roads, because as Hilton notes, each road seemed to have a different tone of rumble. This varied hum lends the film a sort of oral coherency, as well as adding to its general feeling of kinesis. The other noises on the soundtrack are episodic, and while spectators may assume that they are presented in chronological order, there is no clear, unified narrative voice. Indeed, Hilton's sound editing is just as experimental as his animation technique. The seemingly random cacophonic collage of sound sequences in the film challenges spectators to identify the sound source and to imagine the various scenes that they hear taking place. Spectators are presented with the challenge of drawing their own imaginative connections between the audio and the animation. Indeed, in any given moment in Stuart's animation, there are multiple layers of information being conveyed simultaneously, often requiring the spectator to read text, listen to audio, and flit their eyes from corner to corner all at once or in rapid succession. In this way, the relationship between the audio and the visual in 6 Weeks in June can be seen as an extreme example of Sergei Eisenstein's theory of audiovisual counterpoint. Eisenstein conceived a vertical montage as a tool that would serve to eschew the lazy spectatorial tendencies arising from naturalism and to force spectators to use their intellect in interpreting the sound film. Of course, in 6 Weeks in June, this idea of naturalistically synchronized sound is more accurately a case of what Michel Chion calls syncresis, a combination of synchronism and synthesis. And there are a few moments in 6 Weeks in June where syncresis actually occurs. It is, for the most part, comprised of labor-intensive, on the part of the spectator, audiovisual counterpoint. However, when those rare synchronized moments do occur, they serve to re-emphasize the controlling hand of the animator, reminding spectators that the audiovisual relationship follows an internal logic or inner synchronization, no matter how arbitrary it might seem upon first viewing. It has a rhythm of its own created out of the varying paces of the animation, played off the cadences of the sound editing. This combination of audio and animation presents an overload of visual and oral stimulation that creates an effect that is specific to each viewing and unique to each spectator. No two spectators will have the same experience of the film, and by concentrating on different aspects, the same spectator can have very different experiences each time the film is viewed. In this way, the film reminds us that we fail to notice everything that passes us sitting in a car, just as it shows us the details Hilton himself noticed on his journey. It calls to mind what psychologist and philosopher William James calls the narrowness of consciousness, and the necessity of forgetting and of ignoring the vast amount of stimuli that bombards our senses at all times. This capacity to ignore and forget is ironically what enables us to remember. Complexly, Hilton's animation technique is a metaphor for this experience, whilst it simultaneously provokes something similar. Now, I mentioned in the abstract for this paper that 6 Weeks quite literally adheres to Michael Renaud's definition of the expressive documentary when he states that, end quote, the focus typically remains on the impression of the world on the artist's sensorium, and his or her interpretation of that datum, or the radical reworking of the documentary material to create sound/image relationships unavailable in nature, end quote. There is a little question that the images we see in 6 Weeks are the results of impressions made on Hilton's sensorium. They are the records of what struck and stuck in Hilton's mind and his memory. And as such, the sketches invite spectators to identify with Hilton's subjective point of view as he literally wields his camera stylo. And what's more, though, I believe that the image's very sketchiness suggests more to the spectator's imagination than a more determined image ever could. And thus, it is in a myriad of ways that Hilton's experimental animation style offers spectators the opportunity to have their own complex kinetic experience of time, space, and stimulation. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that, personally, I'm no stranger to long hours on the road. I grew up on a ranch in the great and giant state of Texas, where the combination of merciless heat and vast distance between desirable destination engenders the natural motto, drive or die. I remember spending summer vacations with my family touring America in rented minivans with broken air conditioners. There was always the whizzing blur of closely passing objects, the slow, steady parallax of faraway things, and the constant rumble of and hum of air, motor, and wheels. I can attest that America seen from the highway evokes a continuously evolving mixture of awe, curiosity, and boredom. And when I first saw 6 Weeks in June, I immediately recognized that this complex experience was being condensed and delivered in sparse, spontaneous shorthand. I identified the pylons, the windmills, and the water towers that I and millions of people have seen. I felt again the rush of movement, the giddiness of transience, the strangeness of unknown places. In their stark iconicity, Hilton's black on white drawings are simultaneously undeniably his, and yet somehow the remembered visions they evoke are also every traveler's who's ever been on the road in America. They're certainly mine, And for me, Hilton's 6 weeks in June makes 11,000 miles feel like a joyride. Thank you.
Lecturer at the University of Essex, and has published widely on aspects of documentary film and television, is, hang on, I'm just switching pages here, sorry Jeff. The title of his paper is Like Nothing You Ever Saw Before Outside of a Dream, Animating Aerial Vision.
I have no idea what you're seeing up there on the screen. Okay, so it's all being revealed here.
It's like the Matrix.
Yeah, I had a little trouble with PowerPoint, so this is a little bit on the low-tech side. I decided to go with a safe option. So if you'll just bear with me. Yeah, I'll just, if it's okay, it won't be entirely seamless, but the images will come up. During the this is called Like Nothing You Ever Saw Before Outside of a Dream, which is a line from World War II documentary, The Memphis Belle. I hope this paper fits well enough in the panel. We'll see what we can make of it. Animating aerial vision. Can everyone hear me back there? During the 1930s and 1940s, the development of what Paul Virilio has called global vision was further perfected through innovations both in photography and flight. In 1936, in the pages of US Camera and National Geographic, for instance, readers witnessed aerial views over the Earth never before seen. In a pull-out supplement, a global panorama, quote unquote, of the Black Hills of North Dakota, photographed from an elevation, quote, of 72,395 feet, near, quote, the division between the troposphere and the stratosphere, revealed, quote, the actual curvature of the Earth, photographed from the highest point ever reached by man. A few years later, even as global vision was being authenticated through photographic evidence, the world was experiencing the most radical experience of divided perception, global warfare. Virilio, of course, has argued how imbricated war and cinematography have long been. There's in particular a quote-unquote deadly harmony that, quote, always establishes itself between the functions of eye and weapon. These connections manifested themselves over the course of the 20th century in scientific and aesthetic concerns in the field of optics, and in the demand in combat for increasingly sophisticated technologies of magnification and sighting, for ever expanding spatial mastery and accurate targeting. The term to shoot, then, of course, speaks to a larger truth, as Friedrich Kittler has also suggested. These discussions, of course, presume the role of photographic indexicality, which seems to be coming up as a sort of the bad guy of this conference. The role of photographic indexicality in enhancing the mastery of 20th century technologized vision. Yet, again, as many have been stressing already in different ways, the role of animation in producing, enhancing, popularizing, and stretching the limits of this vision has been far less prominent in scholarship. I want to consider here really just quite a small element of this much larger phenomena, which is the emphasis on aerial perspectives and mapping, both actual and conceptual, found in US Second World War propaganda documentaries. It's quite, again, a narrow, and I want to stress just how narrow that frame is. These documentaries range from Office of War Information productions such as Valley of the Tennessee. I was assuming these films wouldn't be too familiar, so I've just listed the main ones I'm going to talk about there. Valley of the Tennessee by Alexander Hamid from 1944, Northwest USA, which was made by the Nikino member Willard Van Dyke in 1945, Van Dyke's The Bridge, 1944, and finally to William Wyler's celebrated combat record, The Memphis Belle, also 1944. I'll be stressing here something usually underplayed, animation's central role in valorizing the power of the aerial view. Documentary animation has long imaginatively situated or emplaced spectators in concrete but unobtainable spaces. Of course, the travelogue and the ethnographic tradition would offer a prominent and quite obvious example of this. Obviously, I'm sure those of you who teach the bringing together of documentary and animation point this out all the time. We have, for example, the maps and charts that open Nanak of the North, 1922, which essentially situate the spectator in the mysterious barren lands, desolate, boulder-strewn, windswept, the illimitable spaces which top the world. And then, of course, the animated map tells us exactly where we are. Yet animation techniques, as this conference is making clear, I'm just wondering what you're actually seeing there. Okay. Rather than acting as mere supplements to documentary reality, work integrally. And I want to come back to this notion of integration very briefly, with photographic liveness to construct what might be called documentary realityscapes. And I think I'll just throw that term out there as a more very generic term that covers a lot of, I think, what we've been talking about, the realityscape. As a sign, a sign, as we know, is a kind of substitute, if an imperfect and incomplete one, for something absent. A sign, as Jacques Derrida suggested in Of Grammatology, is therefore a kind of supplement. An aid deployed when something over there and elsewhere is brought into social and communicative presence. However, a sign isn't simply subordinate. I'm sorry if this is familiar to many people. As Derrida argues in his against-the-grain reading of Rousseau's Supplement or Supplement, where Derrida contests hierarchical readings of the relationship of writing to speech. Again, I want to apologize if in the context of documented animation, someone's already done this already. Paul, you would probably know. But I just thought I'd use this supplement as a kind of trope, really, for what's happening in the relation between documentary indexicality and animation. Derrida traces a line of thought from Rousseau's Émile and the traditional praise of living speech, which stands opposed to the fallen or derivative realms of writing. Here, living immediate speech might be called a kind of direct experience, while writing is a sign that points to speech. Speech is privileged, more immediate and connected with the presence of the speaker. Writing merely preserves speech in the absence of the speaker, or substitutes for it. I hope you might see where this is going in terms of conventional definitions of documentary, which tend to privilege the illusory presence of the photographic index, not just the index, but also then photographic realism, which I think is a slightly different thing. And again, tell me during the break if someone's already made this comparison before. Privileging speech over writing presupposes what Derrida calls a demand for a quote-unquote transcendental signified, a metaphysics of presence, something that exists outside of other more derivative or supplementary signifiers. The photographic index has often functioned as just the sort of transcendental signified in established definitions of documentary, sometimes supplemented by so-called derivative or fanciful representations such as drawing, animation, and digital effects. And in an earlier panel, we actually gestured to Enlightenment traditions of setting up some of these hierarchies between science and aesthetics, fanciful drawing, and so-called documentary or observational drawing. Supplements are called in precisely because there is a lack in what is supplemented. The supplement is both a replacement and an addition, that which at once supplements and potentially supplants. Because this double meaning is always there to undermine any absolute denigration or subordination of supplementarity, which may be at once both integral and additional, the dangerous supplement, and again, Derrida here quotes Rousseau, is always an ambivalent and potentially disturbing concept. So, is animation documentary's dangerous supplement? Can it any longer be viewed as added on or a weak substitute for photographic signifiers that themselves speak directly and completely? Just as a few years ago it seemed that the avant-garde had been written out of documentary histories, animation returns to disturb established histories of documentary, which range, again, from the elegant meditations of Gilberto Perez to the magisterial work of Eric Barno. Animation resonates across documentary if we home in, for example, on the complexity of the form's evidentiary functions. Again, for example, the living map that helps to taxonomize and make familiar the technical, temporal, physical, and spatial distances that might be out of frame, impossible, in Michael Shannon's terms, the invisible representation. In wartime documentary, we see this suturing of animation and live action footage put to explicitly ideological purposes, and I want to think a little bit more about that in this paper, through the aerial view. We also see a symbiotic as opposed to hierarchical relation of animation to photographic realism. And I suppose if I'm adding anything to the brilliant work I've already seen in this conference, I hope it's maybe a little bit of a historical perspective, because certainly in traditional expository documentary, animation is almost invisible. People don't really see it. It's never really talked about. There are a couple of other contextual points that should be made here very briefly. A number of critics, including Marion Staines, Jonathan Kahana, and Charles Wolfe, have stressed the development of documentary photography and the emergence of the so-called expository mode during the Depression-era 1930s, showing the establishment of government-sponsored documentary culture as closely linked to figures such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's head of information in the Resettlement Administration, Rexford Guy Tugwell, who were ideologically married to progressive economic and social theories based on social management concepts, such as those of Frederick Winslow Taylor, part of what Marion Staines calls a highly technocratic pro-corporate ideology. Overviews of social and economic networks were by the 1930s strongly influenced by emerging theories of economics and disciplines like sociology. These concepts were married to quote-unquote Taylorized management and Fordist mass production systems. Notions of the scientific management of social diversity through orderly design, already embedded in the academic and industrial zeitgeist, were by the 1930s strongly felt in US governmental agencies that would be producing documentaries. And I'm sorry if this is, again, going back through familiar territory. I just felt it was really to think about this aerial perspective and its power during the Second World War. I wanted to stress this background. As Kahana notes, documentary photography and cinematography were perfectly suited to the optic of social, scientific, and economic rationality of what might be called the high modernist state. This marriage of aesthetics and ideology can be seen in the overhead and aerial images of land management. For example, here, Robert Flaherty's The Land, another image from Robert Flaherty's The Land. Again, quite beautiful, also highly technocratic images. As a lot of people know, this film was barely seen. Also in documentaries like Van Dyck's and Ralph Steiner's 1939 World's Fair film, The City. Such documentaries, as Kahana continues, offered images both strange and beautiful, mixing environmental and ideological visions of space that was socially constructed, highly and ideally scientifically managed. At the same time, the rise of documentary as a state apparatus around the world found its particular articulation in the US with the liberal left coalitions of the Popular Front, where a discourse of the people and the idea of public interests were becoming paramount. Sorry if there's quite a lot, but it is quite important to thinking about how the World War II propaganda documentary actually functioned socially. So documentary so-called maturation in the US under figures like Par Lorentz coincided and was facilitated by its adoption as a mass communication device institutionalized by the liberal state in the service of the nation and of national citizenship. Of course, this is only one strand of documentary I'm talking about. I'm not obviously talking about Film and Photo League and that quite important simultaneous background. So a few years later, during the Second World War, with Roosevelt still in power and his documentary projects of the 1930s still resonating, most government documentaries were produced by the newly formed Office of War Information's Overseas Bureau, headed by Robert Riskin in New York. Riskin oversaw an incredibly ambitious series of documentaries devoted to psychological warfare and to projecting pro-American propaganda to Allied, neutral, and key embattled regions. As Ian Scott contends, Riskin was committed to promoting documentary as a tool for persuading audiences around the world to endorse the idea of America restoring order to a dangerously disordered globe. Riskin made use of experienced documentarists who had come to prominence during the 1930s, again during the rise of the technocratic and liberal US state apparatus. Willard Van Dyke made Northwest USA, which focused on the Northwest, the American Northwest, the US Northwest, as a quote-unquote crossroads of the air, a gateway to international trade routes with Russia, Latin America, and East Asia. Working with Ben Maddow, another very well-known figure from the 30s, who ultimately became blacklisted. Van Dyck also made The Bridge, another film that evokes an aerial perspective in examining air transport links between Latin and North American countries. In the opening scenes of Northwest USA, the Earth is imaged from, oops, it doesn't want to go. Let's see. The Earth is imaged from high above, whoops. I'm not quite getting the same thing on both frames, but that's okay. The Earth is imaged from high above its surface. The world suggests a paradox, globalized, potentially intimately connected, yet intensely conflicted, in desperate need of unification. Moving from the animated God's Eye view to the spectacular aerial shot, then to the everyday world at street level. So obviously the animation moves towards the northwest of the United States, and then it moves to the actual, photographic plane landing. Then it moves back into animated charts and graphs, which show you a perspective not then photographically possible. So it moves between this universal and impossible perspective into the realms of the mundane and the particular. The juxtaposition reminds us that even the outer frame, the invisible to the naked eye, is related to the day-to-day world's fluxes and transformations. And all of this might be captured in orderly patterns. So you see that obviously the animation moves us in, this is a very familiar pattern, moves us then to a photographic aerial image, finally another photographic aerial image, and then another aerial image taken from land, in this case of Seattle, and then finally to the ground. And the film actually ends then by gesturing back to the sky. It says, so the children will look up at the sky, and we see another plane, planes without bombs or gun bays flying every hour to Moscow, over the North Pole, flying to Iraq and London, and drawing their straight circles in the geography of the air. Working in a more openly didactic mode, another Office of War Information film sponsored under Riskin's management with the assistance of Philip Dunn, a name that might mean something to some people, was The Valley of the Tennessee, which dramatizes themes explored in Lorenz's more famous The River, which appeared several years earlier. As in the earlier Lorenz film, Hamid surveys the problems of drought, flooding, New Deal solutions brought about by the US government and the Tennessee Valley Authority. Alexander Hamid is probably best remembered for collaborating with his wife Maya Deren on the avant-garde psychological study Meshes of the Afternoon. In his film Valley of the Tennessee, which opens with a striking shot taken from a water-drenched lens, it turns out this image is actually of a seaplane taking off from San Francisco Bay. As in many of these OWI, or Office of War Information films, we again see an aerial perspective surveying the American scene. American life is first viewed from above until the plane, obviously then you see the plane's journey. There's no point to this plane ride, by the way. It's completely superfluous to the film. There's no reason why it should start by taking off in San Francisco, because the film's actually about Tennessee. So we then see an overhead shot. In this case, it's obviously Los Angeles, which then moves quite quickly to a Tennessee schoolroom, where we see wide-eyed, impoverished children crowding a shabby schoolhouse. Government initiatives, the film insists, are designed to address these wants. They're performed for and by the people. The voiceover here by Walter Houston. The development of the people is the first concern of democracy. An animated graphic then appears. So here we have the children in the schoolroom. Oops, where is it? Oh, an animated graphic then appears showing a bird's eye view of dams built along the Tennessee Valley, which encapsulates the role of the aerial shot, envisioning a scientifically engineered, tailorized, and industrial efficient nation. So we have the children then being showed models of dams which manage the water in the Tennessee Valley. And then ultimately it moves to this animated overhead view. The rivers and tributaries in this sequence branch out like veins and capillaries, yet managed by human ingenuity and collective labor. The voiceover states this labor is performed for and by the people. The whims of nature can be controlled. The water can now be dispatched, the voice contends, just as trains are dispatched from a railroad system. The harmony of authoritative graphics and voiceover strive to delineate the holistic social body of the American nation. Once defined by its relation to the frontier and the wilderness, American can be made strong by careful management of the technological organization of wild nature, itself now reduced to resources and power. In propaganda documentaries such as Valley of the Tennessee, the marriage of different media and representational strategies strove for an integrated rather than hierarchically configured layers of animation, automation, photography, voice, and music in the documentary experience. Here, expository documentary is realized as the counterpart of an alternative to classical Hollywood entertainment. So I'll just take you through those. Here you see water can now be dispatched as trains are dispatched on a railroad system. Hamid's soft propaganda film conforms to views at the time amongst US intelligentsia that propaganda might serve as a constructive social tool. Propaganda, it was argued by Ralph Tyler in 1942, can identify difficulties in our society. It can help people become aware of the beliefs and aspirations of various groups. It can also be a useful source in which to seek possible solutions and a kind of social unity of social action. The final shots of Hamid's film are these sweeping images of the water resources that have been constructed, sophisticated dam building technology, which follow on from those animated graphics we saw. Finally, various images of dams move to a close-up of a girl whose expression here shifts from awe, looking at the dams, to sort of pleasure, to determination. It brings the film full circle, resolving the images of the poverty-stricken children, the confused-looking children at the early sections of the film. So through an arsenal of instructive media, the blurred confusion of the film's opening shots is replaced by a clear picture of the social body of a nation now restored to health. How am I doing for time?
We have 4 minutes left.
Okay. So my last example, let's see if my film clip is still there. It's from the Memphis Belle. A much more famous film than the ones I've been talking about. Don't know if you've actually seen it. A landmark combat record that's still widely admired for its slice-of-life action and gritty realism. The commentary by Eugene Kern stresses at the film's start, this is a battlefront, a front like no other, not a traditional front based on the ground war, but an air front. The stress on the air war recalls the persistent theme in Second World War documentary, the prominence of the airplane in the bombing raid captured by the motion picture camera and the aerial shot. Just as the gun and camera shared a special relationship in pre- and early cinema, so the airplane bombing camera shared a symbiotic relation in World War II cinematography. Ultimately, in the Memphis Belle, here you see this emphasis on the overhead shot. Ultimately, it's a slice of life of a bombing raid. In the Memphis Belle, as the gaze of the camera lines up with the crosshairs of the machine gun, we witness what Paul Virilio has called the deadly harmony between aerial camera and weapon. Yet the Memphis Belle isn't merely a straightforward documentary representation of the aerial war. It's rather a complex technical and cultural artifact that engages with broader multimedia and cross-generic strategies for producing an aerial gaze over the war itself. The Memphis Belle is closely linked to an emerging aerial perception, a form of perception characterized by distance and remoteness from conflict while simultaneously witnessing. So it's the idea of remoteness and witnessing at the same moment, which is quite important to this film. It encompasses a collective sense of mastery created by a process of overlooking. In the film, designated bombing sites are described as, quote, pinpoints on the map of Europe, targets to be destroyed. Aboard the Memphis Belle, we do experience the crew's vulnerability, but it's difficult to deny the simultaneous exhilaration derived from flight. and the mastery of its view. So if I can start the clip, I think it's gone back. Again, obviously the animation here seems like a sort of add-on, moving to a space that the camera could no longer realize, giving an overview, if you will, of the war, which corresponds to the map of Europe. The Memphis Belle, however, encapsulates a marriage of ideology, experiential witnessing, and aesthetics in aerial warfare. In the scene we just saw, the sunlight glistening off plains arrayed in neat formation against a blue sky afford an undeniable visual impact. In fact, some in the military said the film was too beautiful. It made the war look too beautiful. Virilio's description is the sky's intense blueness, which is at once luminous and laden with gloom. As the voiceover says, you look out at the strange world beyond, reflections in plexiglass like nothing you ever saw before outside of a dream. Yet in the midst of imparting this intense beauty, Weiler augments or heightens the visual and acoustic space by shifting to a sequence lasting just over 3 minutes, where animated maps and charts reveal the plans behind the mission. The maps give a precise overview of the target Wilhelmshaven, the animated graphics both mimicking and enhancing the Memphis Belle's point of view, which has by this point been specifically and precisely aligned to the viewer's point of view. Though this form of animation might to many appear primitive, arguably it forms part of what Guy Debord has called the integrated spectacle, and actually Debord has come up now twice, at least in papers I've seen. Suzanne has mentioned it in Mark Bartlett earlier. Indeed, animated propaganda documentary was already quite sophisticated by this time, as Disney's Victory Through Air Power had already showed. That film, if you've seen Victory Through Air Power, was said to have influenced the escalation of the Allied bombing campaigns during the war. In any case, history would make much clearer what was not fully visible from the air. 1943 saw Europe in the midst of a total war of mutual annihilation. As we know, Wilhelmshaven contained a subcamp of the notorious Neuengamme concentration camp. 2/3 of Wilhelmshaven's buildings were destroyed by Allied bombs. In one civil damage report after a USAAF bombing raid of 26th of February 1943, bombs fell heavily on civilian areas. 2 schools and 2 police stations were damaged. 19 civilians were reported dead. According to one Air Force publicist, the intent of the Memphis Belle was to, quote, show the ultimate destruction of Germany from the air. But the human costs of bombing are actually highly restricted. They're completely restricted from view. Around the time, actually, I do have some images to speak to that. Around the time the Memphis Belle was running its daylight raids, as we now know, residential and urban centers were being targeted by massive Allied nighttime campaigns. By the war's end, millions on both sides had been killed. One of these raids, Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg, is quite elegantly rendered by Sebald in his writing. Aerial perception, as many have argued, depends on a detached, mediatized perspective that can suppress unpleasant details of death and destruction. In this sanitized view, Patricia Zimmerman suggests, quote, the physical and psychic horrors of war, its micro-practices and dismemberments, its fragmentations and disruptions must be suppressed. Here's just a few images. Slowly rot across the extent of the map. Present-day simulators attempt to make the real, all of the real, coincide with their models of simulation. The illusory fusion of animation and photographic index, notable in the video game stylizations of images of the First Gulf War, more recently in films, if you want to call it a documentary, the WikiLeaks film Collateral Murder, which is based on images taken from an Apache helicopter of people being dispatched in Iraq. The remoteness of these images from the real, of course, suggested to Baudrillard that the First Gulf War, did not take place. Yet this might be found in the ideological functions of aligning the animated and the indexical in earlier propaganda documentaries. As Paul Ward argued this morning, in placing animation at the forefront of contemporary documentary practice. Even these older films, even in these older films, one might see animation not as an interruption, nor as a superfluous, distracting addition, but as a kind of supplement, integral to the realityscapes produced even by a traditional, in this case, expository documentary. Thank you.